Hi, good morning. Stan Stahl here with Secure the Village. Welcome to our webinar. Our guest this month is John Coleman of uh, the banking community. The second time you're on with us, John. Yeah, so welcome. But for us, kind of the really nice news is we have a new sponsor this month, and it's the Los Angeles Cyber Lab. They're graciously sponsoring, helping us co-present this webinar. So we want to thank them. We want to give a call out to the Los Angeles Cyber Lab as well. They were launched in August of 2017. It's a first of its kind public-private partnership. LA Cyber Lab is a nonprofit organization. They're dedicated to protecting personal and protected information from malicious cyber threats by facilitating and promoting innovation, education, and information sharing between Los Angeles's public and private sectors for the benefit of the entire community, both businesses and residents. They're dedicated to sharing the latest cybersecurity threat data, alerts, and intelligence gathered by the City of Los Angeles and its partners, including the Department of Homeland Security. There's a daily news report that you can get in your inbox, and either in your inbox or in your firewall, near real-time threat intelligence, a daily summary of threat intelligence, and as I said, you can get it near real-time directly into your firewall. There's a board of advisors of the of LA Cyber Lab. It's led by the mayor, Eric Garcetti, and it's got over 28 top Los Angeles business and government officials helping to lead their mission. And we in Secure the Village are particularly proud that we're a part of that advisory board. Membership in LA Cyber Lab is open to everybody, no cost, no obligation, and you can find out more at their website, lacyberlab.org. So please take advantage of the opportunities that LA Cyber Lab offers. And as I said, we're particularly proud that they're sponsoring us on this webinar. So thank you for that. So with that, let's get started. I said our guest, John Coleman. John just recently left being EVP of Information Technology at Pacific Premier Bank. He's now on his way to another institution, but yeah, we can't talk about that yet, John. But do say a few words about who you are and what you're about and what we're
Sure.
doing here.
Yeah. Well, good morning. Thanks for inviting me, Stan. I really appreciate it. It's a great topic and happy to help out. I have over 20 years experience in IT and financial services, most recently with Pacific Premier Bank, which really was as a result of their acquisition of Grand Point Bank. I was the CIO for over 6 years with Grand Point Bank, and for a good bit of that time, I was also the Chief Information Security Officer. My career originally was founded in auditing and regulatory examination work in the insurance sector. So I always like to say that the foundation that I had in auditing and the regulatory side were excellent primers for getting into certainly information security, but also IT, because more and more these days, especially in heavily regulated industries, controls are absolutely critical, and the regulators hold us accountable ever increasingly.
And well, they should, as we've talked about it. You in the audience may recognize John. John was my guest as well in the 6th webinar where we talked about the information security risk assessment, and that dovetails quite nicely into third-party security management, which is just part of the reason we have John back with us today. John, you didn't mention, but you're also a very valuable member of Secure the Village. You're on our board of directors, and we're grateful to you for that. So with that, let's jump into our topic. Let's get started. We'll be talking about the third party's challenge. some of the basic requirements around third-party security management, the security manager's responsibilities, and then how that flows out into the rest of the kinds of things that one wants to do from a vendor security management. In terms of why, we put this chart together because it's just so illustrative. What you're looking at on the left is a story from just last week, November 28th. Atrium Health gets hit by an attack on AccuDoc, one of their vendors, and it affects 2.65 million individuals. That's identity theft and privacy issues for those more than 2.5 million people. And in the story, the stories from Health InfoSec story. One of the interviewees says, and I'm quoting now, to the extent possible, it's important to conduct some kind of risk assessment of third-party vendors at the time their products or services are being evaluated. It's not enough to only sign a business associate agreement, which, of course, if you're in the health industry, is a kind of a requirement. No requirement for that in other industries. The idea critical is some kind of risk assessment. And what you see in the logos on the right-hand side of the screen, Sears, Target, Delta, Best Buy, Home Depot, Universal Music Group, Goodwill, MyFitnessPal, Hyatt, and lots of others. These are all major breaches that were the result of vendor weaknesses that allowed those breaches to happen. So that kind of puts the context for today, why this is such an important matter. And now, John, let's begin to talk about some of the key objectives. And first and foremost, you want to avoid disastrous consequences. So take us through.
Yeah, absolutely. This is self-explanatory. It's very obvious that things can go drastically wrong when you have an incident occur, and if you don't have good controls in place. With respect to vendors, the same things that can happen to the vendor can happen to you, or worse. After all, they're your customers that they may be processing. They're your data. So the problem may occur with them. They may not even have, there may be no public disclosure of who they are. So you're left with the consequences if something goes wrong. Financial losses, complaints, loss of customers, regulatory sanctions, fines, legal judgments, damage to your brand, losing market share, and in the worst case scenario, the business can fail. So these things, and not only are these risks from a security point of view, but also a business continuity point of view. So when you look at vendor management, it's, information security, it's a continuum, and really the idea is to look at it not in any narrow information security sense, but to think more broadly about, what could go wrong with this vendor. It may start with information security, but it could involve other things, even, excuse me, incompetent management. They just don't do a very good job of what they're doing. So that sort of thing.
Right. Yes, as we were talking about this slide, as we were putting this presentation together, one of the things you said that I thought was very accurate and apropos to this, you can outsource a process. Okay, you guys go take care of this process for us, but you can't outsource the risk associated with that process. That risk still stays with you, the company. And that was something you shared with me, as we were talking about this, and it seems to me it's just such an important point here to make. You can outsource the entire business, the risk stays with you.
Exactly. And often when businesses enter into outsourcing agreements, they're doing it because they want to offload something that's not their core competency. A bank is a bank. They service customers, they process, or they handle deposit accounts or loans, but they're not an IT organization. So that's why it's become, almost universal among institutions, 50 billion and lower, maybe a little lower than that, to outsource processing, outsource core systems, and the thinking of executive management might be, gee, this is great because we're gonna get out of stuff that we're not very good at, but you don't get out of the responsibility for it.
Right, exactly. And as I'm listening to you talking, I'm thinking of Target and their HVAC contractor. Target's not in the business of HVAC. They outsource that. The HVAC contractor gets hacked, and before you know it, Target's hit. And it works that way. So he's the same with the medical thing. I mean, medical marketing is not something hospitals and insurance companies are good at. They outsource it. But then the outsourced marketing company has all that information about the hospital or the insurance company's customers and all. So with that, let's move on to so what are the challenges related to third parties? And just to start this, I mean, I think, again, your point, information security, sadly, still in today's world, is often given a lower priority in vendor selection and outsourcing initiatives. You're looking for a company that can they get the job done as more important or more critical or more considered than can they get the job done securely. So I mean, again, there's a lot of issues here that we can talk about.
Exactly. The challenge for the information security manager is really to get your seat at the table. You need to be taken serious as an equal owner in the process. There's nothing more frustrating than finding out well into a process or a discovery process that there have been several meetings with a vendor, there have been requirements conveyed, and you're just now hearing about it. That's unfortunate, and it's a real missed opportunity because often what happens is the information security professional will bring up some extremely valuable and important information that should have been surfaced early on in the process, and they bring it up and it's like, well, gee, you're late to the party, we're so far down the track. And then the conversation becomes more about how can we salvage this, what are the workarounds, how can we mitigate this risk, as opposed to, well, we had 3 other vendors and we could have looked at those same things to see how they compared from a security perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we've been in this situation often with clients where they will come to us and they'll say, okay, here's a vendor we want to use. And we'll say, well, have you done any security reviews, security assessments, any of that to make sure they're okay? And it's like, no, not yet. And so we'll go take a look. And as you said, now we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do we say to our client, these guys, you really don't want to trust them with your information, with your customers' information? Or is it, okay, how do we put patches and Band-Aids and all on this mechanism, on the vendor, on the processes and so on, so we can minimize that security risk? Often if you get into the game and sit at the table early enough, those problems go away. By the time you're selecting a vendor, you've already done at least some measure of due diligence on their security here.
It can be even harder in situations where maybe a new business owner is on the scene and they have preconceived ideas about, this is a vendor that I've dealt with. I want to implement him. Right. And it's almost treated as a foregone conclusion. So
right, yeah, and those would just make it difficult. Other challenges, just looking at some of the notes we have, the difficulty in getting incident reporting. One of the things I've liked about the HIPAA regulations requirements is that if you're sharing information with a third party, you must get a business associate agreement. I mean, that's a piece of the legal side of it. There is no equivalent in other areas, particularly where there's not a regulation involved. And we've felt, and again, we recommend this to our clients, even though a business associate agreement isn't needed, let's take the language from a business associate agreement, put it in another agreement, call it what you want. Don't call it a business associate agreement, or people will say, well, we're not covered by HIPAA, so we don't have to do it. Call it something else, but get it done so you've got that legal framework in place. Particularly if they have an incident, they must notify you. That's got to be, to me, critical in this piece.
The information security manager, one of the things that you can do in discussing with a vendor the issues related to information security and trying to find out what their controls are and trying to make them raise the bar, or at least give you the information to determine how high the bar is raised, is that they need to understand that that's valuable. If they can prove that they are serious about holding themselves to a benchmark such as HIPAA requirements or FDIC requirements, some type of standard, that's really, really helpful when it comes to proving to a potential client that not only do you understand their business and do it very well, but that you do it safely. So that's one thing that I try to do when I'm talking to a vendor, is that it's a win-win. It may not be their first choice, but that they should take it seriously. And it's hard, you don't, once you're in business with the vendor, it's hard to get reports that really focus specifically on information security related things. On the front end, you may be able to go in the due diligence, get some information about their risk internals and what their controls are. But afterwards, getting specific information about incidents or even details about their disaster recovery testing can be very challenging.
Right.
So one of the other things here, another challenge, is that if they do provide you information, it's very common, especially in my world, that you get what's called an SOC report based on Statement of Auditing Standards SSA 16, excuse me. Those reports are very interesting, but they are often flawed. They quite often overlook information security controls, and they focus more on general business controls. So you have to take the information in those reports with somewhat of a grain of salt. The other problem too is that I hate to say it, but the veracity with which those reports are done is often suspect, because the audit firm it's a client. They want to give them a product that's useful, but they don't want to make it so damning that they damage the client's reputation or have a hard time getting an engagement back. So
exactly.
You need to get those things, but don't hang your hat too heavily on them. Pen testing is also very good. You typically won't get the detailed results, but you can at least get some sort of a letter or a statement saying, we do this testing, any issues raised are promptly corrected, etc.
Yeah.
And that may be as good as you get.
Yeah.
Last thing is the effective oversight for third parties is a continual process. It doesn't end with forming the relationship. It needs to be ongoing. We'll talk about it a little later. There needs to be ongoing due diligence overall and at the information security level.
Right. Yeah, we'll often do with our clients who have a vendor, let's say a IT firm or a web developer, things like that, where there's a lot of access to very sensitive information. We get that vendor in every month for discussions of security as it applies to our client, as an illustration of that. What you say about pen tests also, because we'll get calls for pen tests regularly. Do you do pen testing? And the answer is, of course, yes, we do. Now, let's begin the discussion of, what do you really mean by a pen test? Do you want us to really break in from the outside? Do you want us to, go onto LinkedIn and Facebook and do all the sort of stuff that, that background intelligence, gathering that and so on? Or do you really just want us to come in and scan your network for you and let you know what your vulnerabilities are and so on? And that's, in part, just in cost, from a couple of $1,000s up to, you can be spending $100,000 and up for a true, honest to God, totally blind pen test to a major company, where you're going to pull out all the stops if your client wants you to do that. So that's one of those areas that we're very, very sensitive to. Let's move on to some of the basic requirements that you want. I'm going to just jump to the bottom of the slide first before we begin to talk about the top slide, because this is where you can get some of the information on this. NIST has the valuable 800-161, very valuable resources. And then the FFIEC, FDIC in the banking world, financial services world, and HHS CMS in the HIPAA world. But that applies not just to HIPAA and financial stuff. I mean, there's wisdom and guidance in those documents as well. So what we've put in the top of the screen are some of the issues you want to pay attention to. So again, let me shut up and say, John, what do you have to say about this?
Sure. So there needs to be some basic components of a vendor management program. They're really very similar to what you look for in an information security program, and they should have a very close handshake. The first one is procedures for assessing vendor risks. There are 2 points at which risk assessing is important. On the front end, when you are contemplating getting into an initiative or signing up with a vendor, you need to go through and do a detailed risk assessment on that particular process. As you said, Stan, we talked about that in the prior webinar. Can the people listening, can they go out and still download that?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
That's on the Secure the Village website. The video, the slides as well are both there, and they're integrated in again with a resource kit. You said you can go to the Secure the Village website and watch the webinar, or you can go to the resource kit and link to it from there. Either way.
Right. And let me just say, if anybody has questions about either risk assessment or third-party oversight, I'd be happy to talk to you. Just contact Stan, and he can get you in touch with me.
Mm-hmm. Or we've got your email address at the end of this as well. And just to jump in, a plug for Secure the Village. What you just offered, that's what we're about. Very much. How do we share information? Yeah.
So talked about the initial risk assessment process. Once you have decided to move forward, it's very, very important that you have an ongoing risk management process. That is a process that should be done at least annually, and it should address the entire vendor population. I won't go into the details now, but it involves keeping an accurate inventory of your vendors, doing a top-down review, coming up with criteria where you generate a rating. It's nothing fancy. It just needs to be consistent as you look at each vendor, the criteria that you apply, come up with a composite score, sort them, and put them into categories. You can have 2, 3, or 5 categories, but the important thing is a high-risk vendor needs to have continual scrutiny, and that would involve obtaining almost the very same information that you started with on the front end of the process. Ask them for their most recent audit reports, ask them for their results of their pen testing, get their financial statements. We'll go into this a little bit more later. Mm-hmm. The next thing that you need to have is documented policies and procedures that in a larger organization need to be board approved. Remember, for an organization to operate well, the board should be risk informed, and they should have an oversight responsibility for information security and vendor management. How can they do that unless they're getting information about the risks, the policies and procedures that are being applied to handle those risks, and having a regular report process on how things are going? So that's very important. You need to have adequate staffing and clearly defined responsibilities. If you're an organization that relies heavily on third parties, you're the information security manager and you're the lone wolf, well, you've got all your internal things to handle, plus this process. You need to go out and either hire a contractor or go to management and ask them for additional support for these processes. And it can be done on a part-time basis. Maybe it's not a full person, but it's important to have enough staffing.
Yeah.
Initial due diligence and ongoing monitoring, that's really goes hand in glove with risk assessment. We'll talk about some of the due diligence procedures in a little more detail down the way here. Clearly defined contracting requirements. We also will provide some information on that. The easiest thing to do is to, once you have sort of created that vendor classification is come up with a simple matrix that shows these are the due diligence requirements that need to be done both upfront and then on an ongoing basis.
We'll show that later in the broadcast.
Yes,
as well.
exactly.
Yeah.
Ongoing oversight by the board and a steering committee. So normally you would have some kind of an oversight body that either is dedicated to vendor management or technology through which this stuff would flow.
Okay, and we've set that up on, if you follow the webinar series, from the get-go, if you will, the idea of a leadership team that supports the security manager and that works around these kinds of issues, and that could be part of or separate from the IT steering committee as well. Again, we've got clients where those lines get blurred because of the nature of the company and how they're managing their risk. But you're right, that ongoing oversight by that group to make sure that things get done properly.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because you think that as soon as you start getting operations involved and legal and the controller or whoever, the process may start to lose control of the process. It's quite the opposite. That's when everybody gets skin in the game and they realize the importance of what is being done, and that they have a responsibility, so that if something does go wrong, they're not just going to look at the information security manager. They're going to look at each of those people that had regular involvement and insight and participation in the processes related to managing these vendors and assessing the risk. So, it may be a challenge to get these oversight processes in place, but they'll pay big dividends.
Right. Well, and that goes to the whole question. And we talked about this in the leadership team webinar, which was, I believe, the second of our webinar series, that it's vital that, let's say you're doing, you've got a vice president of sales and marketing, let's say, so nothing to do with security ostensibly, but absolutely responsible for finding web organizations that can support the firm's marketing and sales operations, whether it's HubSpot or MailChimp or any one of a number of different things, including web development companies. I'd much rather have that person on the leadership team, so they're part of the whole strategy development and implementation of cybersecurity, than have them on the outside coming to the leadership team and saying, oh, we've got to go do business with www.whatever because they're vital to our business. And now the leadership team for the first time looks at them and says, wait a minute, these guys, think security is spelled, with no vowels or something. They don't have a clue what security is all about. Much rather have this vice president of marketing and sales in the discussions from the very beginning. To use a crude remark of Lyndon Johnson's, former president Lyndon Johnson, one of his sayings was, I'd much rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And you want everybody inside the tent. You want them all part of that team for just that reason.
That's exactly right. Because let's face it, the information security guy is not going to own that relationship. It's going to be owned by the business units.
That's right.
And they're the ones that have the leverage. So if they're in that organization and in that oversight role, then then you've got the right people on board to advocate for you when you're trying to get information from the vendor or changes made in the way they do things.
That's right. Or even to say on the other side, wait a minute, are we really pushing too hard on security? Maybe, we only have to do what's commercially reasonable. Let's have a discussion around what that is. Maybe security is pushing too hard, which can also happen. We've been in engagements where our client, if you will, our point of contact, frankly, there have been a couple of occasions where they wanted to put in such onerous security requirements that nobody could do anything in essence. And so making sure you've got that balance, again, requires that everybody be on the team, that there be dialogue, conversation around this. Again, that's part of the Secure the Village concept.
Yeah, it's a really healthy process. Every control is not a good control. And
that's right.
you need to have a spirited discussion about what makes sense. as I tell people that have worked for me in the past, that you better watch out as you fashion policies and procedures that you think are really good, and I'm going to hold myself accountable. Well, you are fashioning a noose around your neck, so you better be able to, live with the consequences.
Right. Okay, so
Last
let's
thing
go.
on here
Oh, go ahead.
is,
Sorry.
I was going
Yeah.
to say, the last thing on here is just there needs to be regular reporting processes. The reporting should be bi-directional. There should be reporting coming from the vendor into the organization, and then the information security function needs to take information, call through it, pull out the important things, summarize it, and then report back to the oversight committee, to the board, and any other constituents that may be involved, including auditors. The auditors will thank you profusely if you have
Yeah.
good information, and that will help you when they come to auditing your function.
Oh, yeah. Friends are important in this world.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, okay. So now that's the general set of challenges, if you will. So now the security manager, of course, has the responsibility for getting all of this done. Again, we discussed the risk assessment specifically on June 6th. I'm sorry, in the webinar 6th at the end of June. But these are some of the things, that beyond just, okay, go get a risk assessment. Here's what it looks like. But there's a lot more, and we've already begun to talk about some of these things. But again,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
important to just
And again,
lay them out.
this is almost like a checklist that as you go back to developing your procedures and carving out responsibilities for yourself and your staff. This is a good high-level list to use, and then each of these can be fleshed out in detail. And you're right, Stan, we did sort of, I think on one level or another, we've sort of talked about these to some degree, so we don't have to go into a lot of additional information about it. We talked about the importance of collaboration, risk assessments, due diligence. We haven't talked about service level agreements very much, but just like there need to be service level standards for production of widgets or servicing customers or whatever, there should be security SLAs as well.
Give me an example.
An example, a really good example actually is patch management. Patch management is in fact a security function, and you would expect maybe some metrics about that and to get some reporting that shows how many unpatched devices were there at the end of the month or something like that, and to make sure that that's reasonable. Some are kind of midway between just customer support and security, such as calls into their help desk. You should get that information, and you should require standards for what constitutes a high impact incident and how quickly that will be addressed and how will it be reported to the business. So there are a number of things that you can include in SLAs. And again, you're to some degree the tail, so you can't go wagging the dog, but there should be some things in there that do support the information security function in addition to just straight business service level standards. Documenting the information security expectations, that can be just more of an internal exercise, but know what you want out of it and periodically check yourself against that to make sure that what you thought you were going to get and what you wanted to get and do are things that are actually happening. And review reports from the third parties, ensure that staffing and coverage is there related to the third party. We talked about internally, but you do want to make sure that they start with an adequate information security process and that they're maintaining it going forward. So if they have key vacancies and they're not being filled, those are important things. Integrating third parties into your organization's incident response program. We talked about the consequences of something going wrong at the vendor. You need to play those out. They need to be in your incident response plan what happens if we are notified or if we detect something major going wrong with the vendor. How are we going to handle that?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, providing reports on the third parties to executive management and the board. Will go into a little more detail about the types of information to include, especially in the board reports.
Right, right. Yeah, one of the pieces that I see here that's so absolutely vital is, and easily overlooked is the integrating the third parties into the incident response program. If they have an incident, they got to notify you right away. If you have an incident that may impact them, you got to notify the vendor right away as well. And there's got to be coordination there. And the plans should have, there's got to be an incident response team in the company
Mm-hmm.
that should reach out and include critical vendors as well, so that you've got that whole piece covered.
If you've outsourced your entire back office, serious consideration should be given to, if not including the main relationship manager or a key designee from the vendor in your incident response team, at the very least to have it as a standby position so that if something happens, they're immediately pulled into the team as part of the regular body that meets to deal with the issue. This also extends to business resumption planning and disaster recovery. You should be in your business resumption plan addressing your third-party, critical third-party service providers, and you should be doing joint testing. So what we do is when our service providers run a disaster recovery test, we ask, can we participate? And they invariably include customers, not all of them, but we try to agitate to be on that list so that when they fail over to their alternate site, we connect into it. We make sure that we can access the systems and everything is working correctly. Likewise, if we have a failure, we need to make sure that if we're running out of our backup site, we can get to all of our critical vendors and conduct the functions that we need to at their locations.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we're going to segue here. We've been starting the why, then we've been focusing on the what. Now we're going to look at the how, the process. Spend the next few charts, the next few minutes discussing the process. Starting with what we've already mentioned, you need to have an inventory. I mean, that's got to be the starting point. That you know who your vendors are, it's maintained and it's kept current. But that's only the starting point, of course.
It is, and it's a tough process. I remember when at Grand Point, when we went through to really pull together our first true comprehensive annual risk assessment after I started, for us, the starting point was going to the accounts payable system and getting a list of everybody that was set up as vendors on the system. It's not all inclusive. There are other types of service providers that may not be necessarily set up as vendors, so you have to think through that issue. But you, right out of the gate, you have, okay, who's the vendor? Typically that system will indicate who is the contact person at the vendor, how much do we pay them? So you're starting to hone in on materiality with things like payments made to those vendors. Gather them all in one big list, and you get your team around the table and you go through this with your criteria in hand, and you begin to rate each one of them. And key criteria to rate them against are things like, do they hold your customer information? Do they have other critical data? You may have data that is critical for the bank or other assets that are critical to the bank that's not customer information that should be protected under equal circumstances. And you try to, through your normal due diligence process or just understanding who they are, what would be the risk to us if they did have a problem, and a serious problem? Would it affect us financially? Could it have customer service impact? Could it have a regulatory compliance impact? All these things, you sort of come up with these criteria for assessing how high that risk is. and then rating them as a first cut rating. The second half of the process is once you've then got your sort of criteria in terms of raw risk level, then you start looking at key controls related to the vendors. And they should be just simple things like, do we have adequate oversight in terms of relationship management? Do we feel that their internal control processes pass the smell test, things like that. It's not perfect, but you have to come up with a process that gets you to a point where you can defensively come up with yes, we analyzed our vendors, we identified the top, 2, 3, 6, 8, however many that were high risk ones that we really decided this is where we need to put a lot of focus and emphasis. The people that will care about this stuff are your insurance carriers. They want to know that you are doing this, and you will get insurance benefits in the rates that they charge by demonstrating that you have an effective oversight process.
Right. Right. And I like the idea of prioritizing the vendors. You have to do this. Let's say you've got, whether it's 10 vendors, 100 vendors, or 10,000 vendors, whatever, because depending on the size of your organization, you can't get it all done right away. That's part of process reality. So the idea of prioritizing your vendors gives you a way to now get a linear list that you can now begin to go knock these things off one by one. Let's look at the highest risk, or take the 3 highest risk vendors. That's what we're going to take care of this next quarter. Then we're going to drop down to the next, and so on. And I want to jump over, because we've already talked about it, the due diligence considerations, some of the factors to consider, and so on. But as you just talked about, the materiality of the relationship, the ease of replacing the vendor, and so on. What else might we say about this slide?
Well, I think the important thing are the factors to look at, when determining, the level of due diligence. The materiality of the relationship, ease of replacing the vendor, criticality of services provided, impact of an outage or business interruption, processing or storage of confidential customer information, performance of compliance-related service, and then last of all, past performance. They've been extremely reliable, and they are, let's face it, there are vendors in the marketplace that are de facto leaders that have tremendous scale and experience. And maybe in our case, those vendors are looked at by the regulators on a regular basis, so they get very close scrutiny. They have a market presence that is known about. We go to user conferences and talk about, what's going on. So we have a pretty good read on those people and a pretty good feeling about the integrity of their organization and controls. And those factors can also be part of what are built into that risk assessment process right there.
Yeah. Well, and I think as you're talking about that, one of the vendors that so many of us are using now is Microsoft, specifically email being moved off to Office 365, and companies using the entire suite of Microsoft, OneNote and SharePoint, and all of those, as well as just the email services. They're a vendor. They still have to be looked at from a security perspective. But on the other hand, they're also a partner in that, for example, when we do an assessment of a client's Office 365 configuration, we use Microsoft's tools to do that. They help us in that process. So there's also, when we look at this list, materiality of relationship, I mean, we're talking email, very material. Ease of replacing the vendor, yeah, you could, but you wouldn't want to. Things, criticality, I mean, email is a critical service. Certainly if we're using SharePoint and all, even more critical. The impact of an outage can be amazing. And we've seen that. So I mean, Microsoft in the last couple of weeks has had a couple of issues where their 2-factor authentication mechanism broke down for a bit. So you get all of these factors built into it, and it's at the same time with a vendor that's really on your side. This is not a hostile relationship, but Microsoft wants to help you on your security as well. So I think that that's the kind of partnership one would like, but that's not to say that you don't have to go through the same set of issues as well.
True.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah. So here's the matrix approach. So let's look at some of the things that you've got on this slide. I like this slide for what it does.
Very simple to develop. We had ours dropped right in our policy, and it was a thing that we were constantly referencing. So on the top, we have the due diligence procedures. We break down the columns by high-risk vendors and medium-risk vendors. We don't put low-risk vendors on here. An example of a low-risk vendor would be, a contractor that you have that's doing landscaping or, pretty perfunctory things that clearly don't involve, getting too excited about.
Right.
And for each of these classifications, we separate out what are the requirements when we are looking at an initial process up front versus ongoing, typically either on an annual basis or at contract renewal. This is not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but this is a pretty good cut at the types of due diligence procedures that should be there at a minimum. So legal review of the contract, clearly for both of these types of categories of high risk and medium risk vendors, there should be legal review of the contract. When you come around to subsequent periods, perhaps annually or at renewal, generally at renewal, you're not going to look at it every year, most likely, unless you've had a lot of, if you do a lot of addenda, and if you do statements of work, things like that, perhaps you would, but at a minimum, you would do a follow-up review when you're doing a renewal because you're going to be signing something. For a medium risk vendor, it's sort of discretionary. If you have a one-page renewal sheet, or maybe the contract is structured to automatically renew for successive one-year periods, so no terms and conditions are changing, so it doesn't require a review at that point. Sending control questionnaires, these are important. These are, and this can be a challenging process, but certainly you need to do it for high-risk vendors. I maybe could have said discretionary with medium risk, but this is where you want to sit down and really come up with, and I can provide some examples of control questionnaires that you could use. Mine are pretty detailed, and the people receiving them, number one, they don't like receiving them. Number two, trying to get them to spend any quality time really thinking about the responses can be hard, but nonetheless, it elicits information from them. It demonstrates to your constituents that you've gone through a process of asking detailed questions about their controls.
Yeah. And on that point, just to jump in, one of the services our clients will often ask us to do is to help them negotiate, navigate the questionnaires and all that they're getting from their customers. Some of that is just follow your nose. I mean, they ask a question, you give the answer. They've got policy standards, they're doing ongoing patch management and so on. But sometimes we had one client who got a questionnaire from one of their customers with 1,500 questions on it. And it was like, whoa, that's a bit much. So one of the things we were able to do there was to sit down with our client and our client's customer and negotiate. Okay, what do you really want to know here? What do we want, what do you want us to provide? And we got that down to about 150 matters that we were able to deal with. So looking at it from the vendor's perspective, there's, this is where the partnership can be so valuable here.
Yes. The questionnaire also, it's important how you construct it. You can tailor it so that it's easier to respond to. Yes, no questions, they're
Mm-hmm.
much more inclined to respond to. If you're trying to get a qualitative or understanding of a particular process, maybe, instead of saying, please describe in detail, blah, 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 having a list of, does your control environment consist of the following, and then
Mm-hmm.
give them something that they can respond to
Right.
in a more selective manner,
Yeah.
a simple manner.
Yeah. Very,
Um,
very, very true. And what
yeah.
else?
So obtaining and reviewing third-party audit reports, we do have a reference to the bottom here. We call it a compliance package, and if we go to, in financial services, if you go to any processor and say, I'd like a copy of your compliance package, they know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's, their financial statements, it's their SOC report. We talked about the SSA 16 reports. It's pen test. There could be a variety of things in their copy of their insurance coverage. And it's interesting what you see, and they're really widely variable in terms of the quality of the information provided. The good news is the overall tendency is towards increasing amounts of disclosure, and with our big processors who are themselves regulated, it's shocking. I mean, we're getting detailed information on pen testing and results, which would have been unheard of, even
Mm-hmm.
5, 6, 8 years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
It's really encouraging. So we talk about reviewing financial statements. Again, this is something you offload to your accounting department or your
Mm-hmm.
controller or CFO. But it should be looked at, especially if it's a smaller vendor that is either privately held or is a startup where risk is high.
Mm-hmm.
Review other information, and there are services that will provide this for you at really not too expensive a cost. They will go through, they'll scan, they'll scour public records, analyst opinions, media reports. They'll look for things like judgments against the organization, your servicing organization, and that sort of thing. Um, Conduct site visits. There's no substitute for going on site and looking
Mm-hmm.
around and talking to
Mm-hmm.
people. By the way, when you do this, think, if you have any sort of sense for how an auditor acts, do that. If not, think if you were buying a house, just apply common sense. You'd be asking a lot of questions. You wouldn't be worried about, offending somebody. You need to get information that's important to you. So don't hesitate to ask, what's this guy
Mm-hmm.
doing over there? Do you mind if we watch him a minute? I'd like to see what he's doing with that paper that he's processing. Anything.
Right.
You're under NDA and you're paying.
Yeah. 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 Now again,
Um,
you've got to be reasonable here. You're not going to conduct a site visit to Microsoft.
well, correct.
But
Um,
to your point,
but
yeah,
yeah,
you got
a
a
good example.
web developer that's critical. Go visit
Yeah,
them.
exactly. No, I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes site visits don't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
But other times they're really germane. Like, for example, if you are under a traditional colo
Mm-hmm.
arrangement and your gear is in a particular site, well, you better be going to that site periodically just to make sure that
Right.
the generators are being tested and
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
Reviewing compliance with SLAs. So, those things can often be multidisciplinary. So the information security manager is not the only person that is reviewing to make sure that SLAs are being adhered to. It should be all SLAs, and there should be a roll-up report on that to get an
Mm-hmm.
overall sense for if the vendor is living up to the agreement. And then contacting other customers. For a big relationship, you certainly think about doing that on the front end, but you can do it later on. You can contact somebody, 2 or 3 years down the road when you're coming up on a renewal and say, we use their services. I just wanted to talk to a couple other people to get their sense if things are still on the right track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and another way to do that is participating in user groups. And so the footnotes here are for high-risk vendors that are typically large and well-organized, there should be no excuse for not participating in user group meetings. If it's a medium-risk vendor, they may or may not have a user group, but still you're encouraged to do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And those are also ways you can learn, not just on the security side, but are we using the vendor appropriately? I mean, are there things the vendor can do for us that we don't know about and we haven't asked, but now because we're talking to another customer of that vendor, we learn about it. So again, it goes into the win-win side of things. I want to move along to the next slide. The next two slides, in fact, running down to the top of the hour, talking about reporting, both considerations to senior management, and then the next slide on the annual report. But let's go through these slides as well, perhaps even running a bit over the hour.
Okay, so very quickly, information security reporting should be tailored to your business. It could be that if you're a small business, you're going to put together maybe perhaps a memo for the business owner and the CFO. Or if it's a large organization, you may be going in depth to a certain degree about what's happening with your vendor relationships. If you have a large vendor relationship or multiple ones, individual reports on those vendors are often warranted and should go to the business owner, and ultimately the information about that vendor contained in that report should get pulled in a summary level into an annual report to the board of directors. And we gave some examples here of, if you have a third party processing claims for a healthcare insurance company, hugely important. You would want to have specific reporting just on that vendor to make sure that things are on track. Or a web development and hosting organization that's processing online financial transactions. Again, critically important. There needs to be routine reporting just on that vendor. The performance reports should be reviewed, as I said, by the business owners and really the oversight committee. So as you put together the reporting, part of the process is that should get submitted to that body. And often you don't sit down and review the reports in detail, but you walk them through and say, these are the reports that are in your package, this month. These are a couple of noteworthy things that you should review, but overall, things look like they're on track. So you want to have evidence that they're being, again, risk informed and understand what you're doing and what's going on with the vendor.
Right.
And then the summary level reports are clearly, appropriate for the board of directors. When you are looking at doing changes either to your accounting systems or your management reporting systems, if you have a data warehouse, if you have, like a management dashboard, you should be involved in talking about what your requirements are for reporting so that those can be taken into consideration as those things are being done. Large organizations, often have specialized applications for vendor-related reporting and management. We had one, and it turned out to be a godsend. And the reporting should be designed to facilitate accounting of both the vendors and internal constituents.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So let's jump on then to the next slide. Spend just a moment or two because we're already up to coming on 11. But the annual report to the board or the management committee, because now we're not looking vendor at a time. We're looking at the whole set of vendors now. Once again.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So the idea is that you should be giving them an update on the highlights of, in effect, your risk assessment. So how many vendors you have in each risk classification, the types of services they're reporting, perhaps changes in the mix from year to year, so that they can understand that there's been either a significant increase in the number of vendors or in what we're spending with vendors. For each high risk vendor, there needs to be a summary of the results of the due diligence. You can go back to the matrix concept and say, these are the vendors, these are the requirements. Did they meet them? Yes or no? And if there's a no on that list, then you have, an explanatory footnote for that. Any important changes in your vendor relationships or the policies that govern how you manage them. Major incidents or issues. So if there are compliance violations or breaches, or if there's a problem with a vendor, perhaps their solvency is in doubt or that sort of thing, those types of things should be called out as, important, signposts saying you need to be aware of this. And then finally, some sort of a result, how results of internal audits and compliance exams, so that they get an understanding of the oversight, not just by you and your organization, but how much are they being looked at by third parties, and are those results satisfactory? And then just future planning considerations. So, we're looking down the road next year. This project is coming up. We may already know that we're looking at these 3 vendors, and we'll be reporting on that later.
Yeah. Again, it's the same idea. Keep executive management and the board inside that tent. Make them part of the process. Stay out of their way day in, day out, but make sure that they're part of that process, at least on an annual basis.
They do have responsibility, whether it's a defined, in the case of, again, HIPAA or the FDIC, there are very clear requirements for board oversight of the information security and vendor management functions.
Yeah. And if you jump all the way back to the very first webinar, one of the themes recurring throughout this whole series has been the idea of cultural adaptation. It's the board and the executive management who are the leaders in cultural adaptation. All the security manager and all can do is live inside that cultural umbrella, if you will. So, okay, so here we are. You followed us through all the way for about the last hour or so. You want to get started. What do you do tomorrow, if you will? And it's literally get this started if you're not yet doing it. And I think if you summarize everything you and I have talked about over this hour, it's identify your third parties with access to sensitive information or critical systems, prioritize them by cyber risk, and then begin conducting risk assessments. And for details on that, refer you back to you, the viewer, to the webinar we had in June, conducting an information security risk assessment, and the information security risk assessment on the resource kit. This third-party security management, we've got a resource kit chapter, if you will, for that. So go to the resource kit. You'll see it down on the left-hand side of the page, all the resource areas. This one's third-party security management. So definitely you want to use that moving forward for your vendor risk management program. If we look for next month, first of all, note the date change. This is vital. It's not the first or even the second Thursday in January. It's the third Thursday, January 17th. My guest is going to be Howard Miller. Howard's Director of Technology Division for LBW Insurance. He's also on the board with John and me for SecureTheVillage, but also he's part of the Pepperdine Graziadillo CYRP. That's their cyber risk certificate program. He's on the board of advisors for that. You can register on SecureTheVillage.org. Generally, our webinar series, usually the first Thursday of every month, but as you see in January, it's going to be the third Thursday. In some sense, next month with managing cyber risk and and Insurance finishes a basic curriculum that we have put together, 12 episodes starting February 1st. This is the 11th of them, third-party security management, with the 12th coming on managing cyber risk and insurance. And that takes us into 2019. What are we going to do? First one, January, we're going to talk about, as we just said, managing cyber risk and insurance. In February, we're going to talk about the cybersecurity threat landscape. We haven't talked about this in over a year now. It's changed. March through December are open. So email us with suggestions. What would you like us to talk about here? That's stan@securethevillagela.org. That gets to me, as do any of the other thousands of emails that I have. Little blurb on us, what we do, Secure the Village, turning people and organizations into cyber guardians. Again, we want to thank very much LA Cyber Lab for being our sponsor this month, for co-presenting this with us. Here's information on reaching out to us. John, your email is here. My email, stan@securethevillage.org. You can also sign up for free Citadel Cybersecurity News of the Week. And if you want to market sponsorship opportunities, just send us an email. We'll take care of that. With that, again, I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank again, LA Cyber Lab. John, any final words?
No, just anybody watching the webinar, if this is your first time seeing anything about Secure the Village, it's a great organization. Stan does great things. I'm really pleased to be a part of the organization. It's amazing. This guy is amazing, Stan Stahl. You can go out onto the website and sign up.
Takes one to know one.
Yeah, well, he has a weekly. He's got a mailing list, and he does a weekly update on cyber risks and important information. And it's a great thing to get each week. So I would encourage people to do that.
Well, thank you for the shout out. I appreciate it. With that, we're finished with our 11th webinar in the series, turning people and organizations into cyber guardians, talking about vendor security management. So thank you, John. Thank you for participating, all of you in the audience. And with that, we are adjourned.
Happy holidays, everyone.